It is my pleasure to moderate the final session of the meeting entitled Science Communication, Outbreaks and Recalls. In this session, we're going to explore the relationship between food safety, outbreaks and recalls, as well as the role that communication plays in all of that. This session is going to be a little bit unusual from the prior sessions. We're going to have one speaker, and that will be followed by a panel discussion where we're going to add several more presenters to the front table. Oh, and I want to say, too, I want to acknowledge the support of the IFIN's Food Microbiology Committee, and you can see the members of that committee listed here on this slide. Oop, too fast. Okay, so I am pleased to welcome to the podium Dr. Jennifer McIntyre. Jen is a food microbiologist and has worked in the Washington, D.C. area for over 20 years, bringing scientific perspective to food safety regulatory issues. I'm going slightly off script. Jen earned her PhD from Rutgers University, and we might be partially to blame for her hanging around in Washington, D.C. for the last 20 years. As part of her PhD, she spent several months working at the National Food Processors Association, followed by an equal amount of time at FDA. I wonder how her career might have gone if she'd visited FDA first. I don't think we'll ever know. Anyway, in 2023, Jen founded Food Safety Strategies to use her extensive food safety experience to support public health. Welcome, Dr. McIntyre.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today and talk about a topic that I find myself talking about a lot, outbreaks and recalls. So my conflicts of interest are numerous. I work for many companies that have gone through outbreaks and recalls, really across the breadth of the food system. I also forgot to note, I am an adjunct faculty lecturer at Johns Hopkins. So I want to start by talking about terminology. Words matter. Outbreaks and recalls are not synonymous. I feel sometimes in the media they're used interchangeably, and they're very, very different. So recall is the removal of a violative product, and there are a couple classifications of recalls. We won't get into that detail unless you have questions for the panel on that. Recalls may, but often are not associated with cases of illness. Outbreaks are the illnesses, but they're only a subset of the illnesses. When we talk about traceability, outbreaks, and recalls, those arrows at the bottom right of the screen, they're moving in opposite directions. When there's a recall, a firm knows what the issue is, they know the product that they're recalling, they're working to communicate this information through the supply chain and ultimately out to consumers to remove that product from distribution channels and try to prevent people from eating that product. In the case of an outbreak, it's too late. Something has happened, people have gotten sick, so we start with the consumers. They're the ones who are ill, and we don't know immediately what's making them ill. So we're moving in the other direction, saying, where did you eat, where did you shop, trying to piece this supply chain together to find that common point, to figure out what is that violative product. So outbreaks and recalls may have a relationship, but they are not synonymous. As I mentioned, outbreaks are only a subset of illnesses. We know that somewhere maybe 5–10% of illnesses are associated with outbreaks, but the remaining 90–95% are not, or at least we're not sure that they are. Recalls may be associated with illnesses. Maybe some of them are related to outbreaks, but there are a lot of recalls where we don't believe that people have become ill. They're done in a precautionary fashion, or the top cause of recalls is undeclared allergens. So I've been asked to comment a little bit, give a little insight on how a recall may unfold from a company's perspective. And the first question is, how do they even know that they may be in a recall situation? And there are several ways that this can play out. And in some ways, that influences the nature of the communications, the nature of the story. So it may be that there is a consumer complaint. Take an undeclared allergen. Someone opens up their ice cream, it's labeled as chocolate ice cream. They find out when they open it, it's peanut butter ice cream. And so they may make a call to that company, or they may post it on social media, who knows? But once the company has received that information, then they need to take action and likely issue a recall. They may also hear from a regulator. A regulator may call and say that I sampled your product, I tested your product in the marketplace and found XYZ, it's violative, we suggest that you do a recall. Then the company can, again, think about what they need to do and likely will issue a recall. They may also have a regulator in their facility, have an inspection where the sampling may occur in real time, an issue may be found right then and there. Again, changing the nature of that conversation a little bit, but still putting that firm in a position where they need to decide if they're going to recall. They may hear from health officials that there's an outbreak, and it's been traced back to them through that traceback process. It may be that this outbreak has been publicized already, because we know that an outbreak is happening. We don't know what food is to blame, what company may be associated with it. And so there may be some chatter, some communications around this outbreak already before the firm is aware that they may be involved in this situation and may need to recall. And then the firm may find an issue themselves through testing, for example, and realize that something didn't go quite right. They're going to need to pull that product back. And if they've released it, that would be a recall. Similarly, their supplier may have had an issue. The company has used this supplier's ingredient. If the supplier recalls their product, then this is going to carry over to that company where they're going to need to recall a product. So there are many different ways, many different triggers for a recall. Ultimately, though, the company needs to make a decision. Will I recall? If I'm going to recall, what am I going to recall? What are the date ranges? What are the lot numbers, etc.? And they generally follow two paths. Now, sometimes they've heard about this issue from a regulator. The regulator already knows. In other instances, the communication comes through a different way, and they need to call the regulator to say, hey, here's the situation, we're going to initiate a recall. At the same time, or depending on the company, sometimes beforehand, they will call their customers. They want their customers, commercial customers, to be able to take action to put this product on hold, to begin to return it before or at the same time that the regulators are made aware of the situation. When it comes to working with regulators, there are slight differences between how FDA and USDA FSIS will actually handle the recall, with FDA letting the firm having a little more liberty in putting the firm's own press release together in the case of a Class 1 recall. FSIS has I would say, a more structured process where FSIS is putting that communication together. So we will see, my personal observation is there's a lot more variation in the recalls, the communication of recalls that you see on FDA-related products, because there's a bit more flexibility if the firm is writing it themselves. Of course, FDA requests to see it. They're supposed to streamline, standardize things, but I've noticed, especially recently, that some people stray from the template. Now, when it comes to alerting their commercial customers, sometimes these commercial customers themselves may issue a recall as well, and that may have a press release if it's a private label product, or if you're the manufacturer of an ingredient, you're selling it to another commercial entity and they're doing a recall. So we may see a lot of press releases around one event, what's at the root one event. So if we ask the question, are recalls and outbreaks increasing? I have a lot to say about this. First, I want to make sure that we're all clear that if we think we're asking the question, is our food less safe? I do not believe that we're able to, for reasons I will discuss, correlate increases or decreases in outbreaks and or recalls with the actual quantitative truth of the safety of the food supply. Interpreting the facts of, I'll focus on recalls first. So first, a recall of an ingredient may trigger a whole lot of additional product recalls, finished product recalls. I think back to, does anyone remember the Peanut Corporation of America? This was many years ago, but this was an ingredient. I want to say there were hundreds of products in which this ingredient was used. They all were recalled. So does that count as one recall, or does that count as hundreds? So the way that we look at the numbers, the way that we interpret the numbers, it may influence our perception of the severity or the magnitude of the situation. If we look at limits of detection, if we're looking more, we're going to find more. Does that mean that these issues weren't there before? No, maybe we just didn't know about them. Does it mean that our food is actually less safe because now we're finding things that were already there before? It's hard. So the effort that we put into surveillance, into testing, may very much impact the numbers that we see in terms of recalls, and I would argue outbreaks as well. And then if there are more rules, to break, we have more opportunities to have a recall. Can we compare recall numbers over time? And the one that comes to mind for me is sesame. Sesame is now an allergen, which needs to be declared. So several years ago, if there was undeclared sesame, it's still a mislabeled product, could be a recall, but it wouldn't be one that would receive a lot of publicity, probably not a class 1. Now that it is an allergen that needs to be declared, well, that changes that severity of the recall, the classification of recall. So how do we compare numbers over time when the rules have changed? On outbreaks, I think we face some similar challenges in how we're going to interpret these numbers. Whole genome sequencing, which has now been around for several years, it has been a game changer in our recognition of outbreaks. For Listeria monocytogenes in particular, used to have many cases, many people ill before public health was able to connect those dots and say, oh, there's an outbreak happening. Now, by looking at the genetics when people become ill, we can say, oh, that one here and that one over there that we would not have otherwise thought were related, they actually are. Maybe there's something bigger going on here. And clinical detection, how many people think they've ever had a foodborne illness? How many people have ever gone so far as to know what that actually was? It was salmonella. It was pathogenic E. coli. Very few. And so we chalk things up to the stomach bug. Well, we're now better able to figure out what that stomach bug was. There's one clinical detection tool, BioFire, that is able to identify things where we wouldn't normally have known what they were. And my colleague actually told me today, not a food-related incident, but her young son had played in some water in a pond, got pretty ill, and it was only after using some of these more advanced diagnostics that they figured out it was cryptosporidium. And in years past, probably wouldn't have been able to detect that. So we can now quantify things, we can put names to things that we weren't able to before. And so again, does that mean that our rates of illness are increasing, decreasing? It's tough to say. There are several sources of data. If you're looking to better understand this, USDA FSIS does a pretty good job putting the information together in a way that's searchable. FDA, in my opinion, doesn't do quite as good of a job. It's a little more difficult to tease apart, to query the data. And so I use some other sources who do that sort of analysis. And there is a Food Industry Council has a recall database. It lists more recalls than most people can easily find, so it's a great resource. Again, not the easiest to query. And the FMI also has put some analyses together year over year. So what I'm choosing to present to you today is a couple of charts that have been put together by one of my former employers, the Atchison Group, not while I was there, but I got permission to share this. They posted this in their newsletter in January in response to the question, are recalls increasing or decreasing? And so the black bars are the total number of recalls. This is for FDA. I'll show for USDA next. This is over about a 10-year period of time, and the red is class 1. Those are the ones that we as consumers are most likely to hear about. They're the ones that generally have a press release, but the black is the total. So class 2 and class 3 as well as class 1. And when they tried to apply a trend line, they said, well, actually, if we look at just number of recalls, it appears, if anything, maybe it's decreasing a bit. But maybe we as consumers are just hearing about them more. For FSIS, a little more difficult to, that the line is not quite as clean, kind of goes up and down a little bit. But it's not clear that there's been a dramatic increase in recalls over this same here, almost a little more than 10-year period of time. But if we look, and I'll go back to the FDA slide. If we look at just the quantitative numbers, the total number of recalls we're looking at is about 400-ish per year. So that's more than one a day. And then we add the FSIS, which are more than 50, maybe not ordinarily 100. This is a lot of information, a lot of recalls that are happening. And you kind of have to wonder, how much do people pay attention when there's so many of these incidents happening? I'll move over to some outbreak data. And here we also have, pros and cons of the different sources of information. CDC has FoodNet. These are confirmed cases of illness, representative of the population, but it doesn't count every single person, and it certainly doesn't consider the underreporting. So when I asked before, do you think you've had a foodborne illness? How many people actually sought medical attention? And we know that most people don't, because it's just not severe enough. And so unfortunately, when it comes to the numbers, if you don't seek medical attention, if they don't figure out what you had, you don't count in these numbers. And so there's a lot of underreporting. It varies by organism. We have some estimates. We can look in the literature, and we see about every 10 years or so, CDC teams of authors have done a great job trying to weed through all these data. We had back in 1999, Mead et al. Came up with the 76 million cases of foodborne illness. We heard that a lot. About 10 years later, in 2011, Dr. Scallon and team revised the numbers, but also revised the methodology. So you can't exactly compare. And the number that people say still today is the 48 million cases of foodborne illness. And more recently, Dr. Scallon did a different type of analysis, a more limited number of pathogens in that, and came up with 10 million. Now, we can't compare and say we're on a downward trend from 76 to 48 to 10 because they're not looking at exactly the same thing, and they're not looking exactly the same way. But they are, I think, excellent references to put a stake in the ground. Another great reference is healthy people, looking at targets for specific pathogens. How many cases of illness do we have, and what is the target reduction for every decade time frame? So I'll go back to another chart that came from that same January publication by the Atchison Group, where they looked at lab diagnosed, so confirmed cases of bacterial and parasitic infections Going again over this about 10-year period of time, actual cases of illness, we're looking at about 30,000 per year. The orange is the outbreak associated. So you see, it's really a minority of illnesses. The majority are still sporadic. But when it's difficult to say we've got 30,000 confirmed cases of illness, but we hear that there's 48 million cases of illness. You know, they're off by many orders of magnitude. And so where does the truth lie? It's very difficult to tell, which makes it difficult to ascertain, are we doing better or are we doing worse? I think just by eyeballing here, we're not doing much better. We're not seeing dramatic reductions for sure. When we think about recalls, we'll go back to recalls again. Most of them are due to undeclared allergens. Are they effective? And there are two very different ways we can look at this. One is, are they effective in pulling the product out of the marketplace? That's a supply chain issue. Is that product still available for sale? The other is, are they effective in influencing consumers' behavior? That's a communication issue and a personal choice. Some great work has been done by the Alliance to Stop Foodborne Illness. They have a recall modernization work group. IFIC has also done some work on consumer perceptions. And a couple of years ago, FDA held a recall modernization workshop that progress in that area seems to have stalled from where I sit. But from the consumer, first you have to say, does someone even know that there has been a recall? Are they aware? How have they been made aware? We have better information now on who's purchasing what with the increases in online shopping. So loyalty cards. Do people find out by social media? I don't think that many people are reading the actual press releases. Then if they even get wind that there's a recall, then they have to make the decision, does this apply to me? And when many of them are undeclared allergens, they actually don't apply to most people. And if they think it applies, do they care? Do they care enough to do something? Do they care enough to look and see if they actually have this product in their possession? And how would they know? Think that some of the information's gotten better in providing photographs, pointing to here's where to look for that code, that lot number, that date. But there are some products for which it's not available, and it wouldn't be easy for a consumer to tell if they have that product. And even if they have gone through all of these steps, then there's still that, do they care enough to do something? And we have to be realistic in recognizing that some people will not get rid of that product. They've purchased it, they've spent money on it. My mother last week was talking about, there was, some of you may be aware, there was an outbreak associated with cucumbers. She said, well, I had cucumbers, but I ate like most of the cucumbers and I haven't gotten sick yet. So I'm gonna keep eating the cucumbers. And we see that people have this perception that they're fine. They can continue to eat this. They're not gonna throw the product away. And so I think there's an awful lot to unpack here. And I suggested that, this topic could take the full 2 days. But we had a limited amount of time, and I'm excited to have the other panelists join to have a more robust discussion on the nuances, the details of outbreaks and recalls. So Don, I will turn it back to you.
So thank you, Dr. McIntyre. At this time, I would like to welcome 2 additional panelists to the stage. Annika Altieri from the law firm Hogan Lovells, and Meredith Carruthers from USDA FSIS. And what we're going to do in the interests of time and moving things along, I'm going to let Annika and Meredith introduce themselves, and then to give some initial remarks on the topic, after which we will proceed with roundtable discussion.
Great, thank you. I am Annika Altieri, and I'm a senior associate at the law firm Hogan Lovells. I'm part of a team of 12 lawyers who focus exclusively on food and beverage regulatory law. Our practice covers food and beverage clients throughout the supply chain from all levels, and a big part of my practice focuses on food safety specifically. We counsel clients through outbreaks and recalls, and then the subsequent regulatory enforcement action that may follow, responding to FDA 483s, warning letters, further escalations, as well as FSIS enforcement. And with that, I will pass it on over to our USDA representative.
Thank you. Yep, and can everybody hear me if I don't lean forward awkwardly? Okay, great. I'm Meredith Carruthers. I am a public affairs specialist with USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service. I have been with the agency for 9 years now, and I specifically work in the Office of Public Affairs and Consumer Education. So, a lot of our agency is out in the field and doing inspections and doing these recall effectiveness checks and things like that. And my team is specifically doing consumer education revolving safe food handling for consumers in the home. And then I'm also on the team that does the recall press releases. So there's a lot that goes into the recall process, as we'll get into details of, but I have been part of that team that is writing recall press releases for about 6-7 years now. So I have a lot of experience with communicating this information to consumers and what we have seen success with and what we can definitely improve on in the future. And another fun tidbit as well is that I have worked on the meat and poultry hotline for the majority of the time that I've been with the agency. And so I have that firsthand experience of speaking with consumers, helping them navigate a recall situation and identifying if their product is part of that recall or not. So yeah, let's dive in.
Great. So this is a roundtable discussion, which means that we would like to have audience participation. I will warn you, I am a professor and I do a podcast and I can keep talking and asking questions for a really, really long time. But I would much rather hear from you with your questions. So while you think about those questions and perhaps begin to step to the microphone, I want to start, and any of the panelists who would like are free to pick up and answer this question. What's the CDC's role in all of this? Because I think sometimes we forget the important role that they can play.
I can take that from the federal side of things. So CDC does a lot of the outbreak investigation. They are heavily involved with looking into what is happening in the illness world. Our teams in FSIS consult with them quite a lot. There's weekly and even sometimes multiple days per week of calls talking about current outbreaks that are on the horizon and what information exists about them, what genome sequencing and other testing has been done to help narrow down outbreak products and, information to help identify products and help identify what is actually making people sick. So CDC is heavily involved in a lot of the outbreak surveillance and the outbreak investigations side of things. They don't have an involvement per se with the actual recalls because that falls under the jurisdiction of FSIS with our meat, poultry, and egg products, and then FDA with all of the other products that are not meat, poultry, or processed eggs, and soluriforms, which is catfish. It's the only fish that FSIS regulates. But so CDC will help with the illness side of things. FSIS and FDA will then, if information presents itself where a product is identified and it can be linked to some sort of regulatory action that would trigger a recall, that's when then FSIS, FDA are involved with the recall process.
Yeah, and if you don't know about the story of catfish, it's a fascinating tale for another time. So we have two people standing at the microphone, so we're going to take the person to my left first and then the person to my right. So please go ahead.
Thanks.
And give your name and affiliation.
Abby Steiner, Cornell University. Thanks for the presentation. When Bluebell had their recall a few years ago, and they pulled all their product from the market, there were these stories of consumers who would try and sell the recalled product on eBay because you couldn't find it. And since then, I've wondered if we would get into a situation where it wasn't consumer mistrust in the food or the company, but in the recall and public health, that becomes the problem. And so I'm wondering if you guys could talk about how we stop that from happening in the way that it seemed to sort of happen for COVID public health guidance as a comparison, given, it's just vomiting and diarrhea, and many of the recalled products may not be contaminated at all. And sometimes, the recalls are out of an abundance of caution. So how do we maintain credibility in the recall itself? Thank you.
Maybe as people think about that, just to make the question even a little more complicated, now we have did say I do a podcast. Make things more complicated is we also have other players in the game. And I remember we had a soy nut butter recall quite a few years, or a number of recalls years ago now, and a good colleague and friend of mine who's kind of obsessed with food safety, she went on Amazon to see if she could actually continue to buy the product, and it turns out the answer is yes, she could. And so so it's not just consumers selling contraband ice cream to one another, it's other players in the retail space. And now since then, I think Amazon has done some things to fix those back doors, but it's a complicated question.
Is it okay if I go first? Okay, great. I want to start by addressing just in terms of recalls. Recalls are very specific, meaning when an item is recalled, all information has to match for a product to be part of the recall. We see this consumer confusion a lot when there's a large name recall or a brand that people are very familiar with. And everybody thinks that, oh my gosh, all products from this brand are therefore contaminated. I'm going to stop eating them for XYZ amount of time and whatnot. So for something like Amazon or a different retailer selling products, people will be outraged because they're like, this thing is recalled or this outbreak is happening. Why are they still selling this product? And what they don't understand is that recalls are very, very specific. And outbreaks are tricky because that is the situation where an illness has been confirmed. We know that people are sick, but it might take some time to find out what is actually causing that, and we aren't sure. And so those situations might involve I think everybody's familiar with the romaine lettuce and E. coli a few years ago. This region of growing has this problem. We haven't been able to identify it farther down scope than that, but avoid this region, versus when a recall happens, or oftentimes even a public health alert happens, those are very specific. There has been a lot of regulatory involvement figuring out what exactly the scope of that recall is, what lot numbers are, what day and times and lines of production were this product being, facilitated on, and therefore what the problem is. So those are very specific. If something is big brand chicken nuggets, that doesn't mean that the chicken strips are involved. That doesn't mean that the breaded patties are involved. So it's very specific, and I think there's a large misunderstanding amongst consumers about what a recall actually means, and that's part of what our team is constantly trying to battle and then educate people on, is how to understand what the information that's being presented is actually telling you.
And backing up one step in that process, this underscores the importance of defining the scope of the recall at the outset. Because you often hear about a recall is announced, and then a week later it's expanded because a company did further investigation and then discovered that product beyond that initial lot or date range is actually affected. And that subsequent announcement is a very hard thing for companies to rebound from, and then also for the food and for the consumers to have trust and confidence in the food supply.
Another factor that could influence people's trust or belief that they do need to take action is, especially in the case of an outbreak, when there has been a trace back and a firm is implicated, a product is implicated, and the firm says, we don't think it's us. And so you have public health officials pointing the finger in one place, but the firm saying, we don't think that there was an issue with our product. And we have seen that happen, and what is a consumer to do? Who are they supposed to believe? And those become very tricky situations.
And just to close the loop on the soy nut butter example, we knew it was part of the recall because this was an outbreak that had been linked to a relatively small company, and they ended up recalling all their products. So there shouldn't have been anything from that company on the market. So there's somebody waiting patiently over here to my right. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Maria Calzonakis at University of Illinois. And I'm wondering, so given that firms have insurance policies for both recalls and outbreaks generally, can you talk about do these cover all costs, most costs? What costs do they not cover? And how does that interplay with sort of firm decision making?
So
Go ahead.
so I can start by saying that while firms generally have insurance, they may not specifically have recall insurance. There are recall insurance policies, but the wording of some of those policies is quite specific in terms of what would allow for coverage in that situation. So we didn't talk too much, but almost all recalls are called voluntary recalls. This does not mean the firm generally has a choice. It just means that they are not government mandated recalls. And so some of the language in recall policies had been that if it's a government mandated recall, then it's covered by your policy. But almost nothing fell under that category because that's just not the way the food system works. So that's been largely addressed. But I think the opportunity to have some coverage by recall, in my experience, doesn't really influence a firm's decision. It may, often along with those policies, there's additional support, technical support resources, 1-800 call numbers that can help the firm get through the recall. And so that can be useful, but it doesn't change the firm's decision-making process around whether or not they need to recall.
And just to underscore Jen's point, I've been involved as an expert witness in some of these situations, and what happens is the company has to make a decision right away about doing the recall. Whether the insurance company is actually going to pay out or not really depends upon that exact language in that policy, and often the company doesn't have time. They just need to make a decision, and then they hope that it gets covered by the policy. Steve, you have a question?
Yeah, question from online. Any information on sort of trends in class action lawsuits related to this incidents?
Yes. So class action lawsuits following a recall are not unusual. We've been seeing those forever. So the typical format that you see following a recall or outbreak is a product liability lawsuit, where if somebody has become ill from eating a contaminated food that was part of a recall, they can bring a claim under a state product liability law. Those aren't necessarily new. What we are seeing that is new is plaintiffs getting a little bit more creative and bringing class action lawsuits under state advertising law. We've seen a kind of a variety of these types of lawsuits last year and into this year, where the plaintiffs are alleging that the marketing and sale of the product is deceptive or false under a state's advertising law because it didn't declare or notify the consumer of the presence of listeria or salmonella. Some of these lawsuits have been settling. Some courts have been mixed in their reception of these cases. Often they've been requiring a showing that the plaintiff actually consumed a product that was contaminated, not just recalled, but also contaminated. But this is, and the flip here is it's a showing of economic harm. It's not physical harm. So that's a tricky new area that we're seeing in class action litigation.
Great, and a question over here.
Yes, I'm always interested in quantifying data. So my question is about the extent of the quantification that you presented in your bar charts and from you guys' experiences. Can exposure data be derived from the recall data? As a toxicologist, what gets me going is if I see a health effect, if I see an inflammatory response, but that's meaningless unless I know what the exposure, if there is no exposure, then it doesn't matter if it's the most toxic. So is there precedent for using the recall data to go into what the potential exposure was or the actual exposure was to a human population, or can it be used in that way?
I don't know that it can be used in that way. Because firms are often many firms are often conservative in their decision to issue a recall. And so an individual unit of product may or may not have the issue that the firm thinks it could have. So there may be no exposure because that product was not actually contaminated. And it's extremely rare when a contamination, especially a bacterial contamination, occurs, that we are able to quantify what were the levels of the organism in the product, how many units actually contain. It is, I think I can only think of one famous case where we have access to that sort of data, because by the time an outbreak is detected, by the time we know people are becoming sick, often that product is out of the marketplace. So we can't go back in time, we can't rewind the clock, we can't retrieve that product to understand what actually happened. And then on the recall side, again, often they are done in instances where you just don't know that a person would have been exposed.
But to kind of talk about a little bit more about your question, there's a couple of interesting things that people have tried to do to kind of crowdsource outbreaks. So one is scrubbing social media data for people who are mentioning things like vomiting or diarrhea. And there's another interesting resource, I'm not so sure it's very popular with the food industry, but it's wasipoisoned.com, where people can go, it's a real website, where you can go on and you can put in, okay, I ate Lucky Charms cereals and, you know, and blah, blah, blah. And that's probably what caused a lot of this concern, which I think turned out to be nothing about Lucky Charms. So there are some things that we're able to do because of social media and the internet, which is pushing things in an interesting direction. I'm not sure it really gets at your question, but there are those kinds of things out there for microbial food safety. And I see we've got another question over here. Oh, sorry. Lights are so bright. Please go ahead.
So kind of build on the question of all the bar chart data that we have seen. I wonder can you kind of add commentary to how much of this can be attributed to any provisions in FSMA and or HARP-C and all the things that were put in place, you know, about 15 years now. Well, you know, since the enactment of FSMA, can you kind of comment on that? Thank you.
Yeah, what's notable to me is that when we look at the time frame in that chart, it goes back to before the preventive controls rule was in effect, and to see that there's not a marked increase or a tremendous decrease in recalls. I don't know exactly what to make of that, but we would have hoped, right, that well, I guess you could argue either way. You could say with FSMA we had more rules, and so there may be more recalls that occur. We could say that we've put prevention mechanisms in place and companies should be following them and they should work, and we shouldn't have any more recalls or outbreaks that have occurred. And I don't think that we're seeing evidence that of either of those things.
Well, and you know, those charts are really interesting because the trend, at least the lines that are superimposed on the top of those, are downward. But if you look at CDC Healthy People 2030 goals, I mean, yeah, maybe there's a slight up or down, and I'm not sure I understand why CDC says something is down when it's hardly down, and another thing looks flat and it hasn't changed. But so what we'd like to see, I think people in the microbial food safety community would like to see, is we'd really like to see those CDC numbers come down, and they're not, right? But as to it's obviously the food industry is working as hard as they can to stop it, so it's not exactly clear what's driving that. Question over here.
Yes, Courtney Bethany, General Mills. I'm curious, you mentioned the challenge with consumers, you know, not even reading a press release or maybe then not responding to the press release. And I've been following the 2D barcode and the sunrise date with GS1, and I'm just curious, probably particularly for you, Jen, on what role you think technology can and will play in the future relative to recall effectiveness.
I think that I think 2D barcodes are super cool. But it takes somebody to actually scan them. And the counterpoint that's raised sometimes when people advocate for putting this sort of information in a 2D barcode is that a fraction of our population won't have access to that information. They don't have access to technology, they don't use technology in that way, and so you're making some of this information inaccessible. But I would think for people who are accustomed to using technology, it's just another way to communicate, it's another way to get the message across. I don't know that while that may increase the person's awareness, I don't know that it will change their behavior. And I do think we have an opportunity to better communicate when people really need to take action. And I'm reminded of the Castleberry incident, which was a botulism. And, you know, the previous speaker in talking about botulism, that's a pretty serious issue. You really want people to pay attention. And it would be considered a class 1 recall, right? But so are undeclared allergens that may not apply to most of the population. And so how is it fair that we're calling both of them a class 1 recall? They get the same sort of level of attention, but to me, they should not. One should get a lot more attention. And so we don't currently have a good structure, a good mechanism of communicating to people when they really need to pay attention versus when they should, or maybe even don't really have to pay attention.
All right, we've got a question over here. Go ahead.
Hi, Byron Chavez from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. My question is a little bit out of the scope of manufactured foods, but you know, we are seeing with food-free laws across many states that some of the cottage foods are becoming increasingly riskier of what people can be making at home. And of course, this is not manufactured foods, but we know that these foods go across state lines. So I would like to know you guys' thoughts on the capacity of the states and municipalities and counties and the federal government to protect public health when contamination is coming from somebody's kitchen.
I can tell you, Myron, from talking with people in the New Jersey Department of Health, it definitely keeps them up at night, right? And technically, it's not allowed to cross state lines, but you know, neither is raw milk, and yet that does too. So I don't know. I mean, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with the boom in cottage foods, right? I mean, and how we're going to find that. I still remember thinking about this. I was serving on a committee, and there were public health people talking about like how they find cottage food operators, and I still think about it to this day. One of the public health person said, well, we just go on Facebook and see who's trying to sell stuff on Facebook. So it's an interesting world. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, another question from online. What is being done already to increase visibility on recalls when they are issued?
So that's certainly a topic that we are continuously looking into, and especially as the federal landscape has shifted in the past few months particularly. When we put out a press release, so any recall that happens, whether it's class 1, 2, or 3, or a public health alert, we are publishing a press release. That press release is getting posted on our website. It's being sent out to media. It's being sent to any subscribers that have said they want to receive information about recalls. It's being posted on our X and other social media channels, and then being advertised in other ways in that sense. But when that press release goes out, we are really reliant on the media picking it up realistically. I mean, somebody has to be following our channels or have had to decide to sign up for that email distribution in order to receive it in those ways. Otherwise, we're really relying on media to pick that up and to run with it. The other thing that is helpful too, then, if it's a company or a place where that product might have been sold, like larger retailers, those we're kind of then reliant on those entities to communicate to their consumers, hey, you might have purchased this product as well. And so while that's fantastic and great, and this has been successful so far in trying to get that information out there, we do see a lot of limitations with people just not seeing the information. And like Jennifer had said earlier, people aren't reading a press release. People aren't understanding what information is being presented in the press release. And we've even done consumer research on it. We've had people look at press releases and say, what of this is confusing to you? What of this makes sense? And what would you identify as the most important things to see or that you would be looking for with a recall? Do you understand recalls? Do you know what you're looking for and how to protect yourself if a recall does happen? And we have truly found, a lot of people don't understand our press releases. They don't understand the details of a recall. And it's something that we're taking internally and really trying to do, like recall modernization, like Jennifer mentioned earlier, and trying to look at how we can better our press releases and better our communications to then be able to increase the visibility on them. Because I don't think we can necessarily try and increase visibility with a product that's not understandable. It doesn't work too well in that sense. So right now we're seeing a lot of information that goes out into the sphere or into the, the space for consumers, and then trying to help them decipher it as best as we can. And so one thing to kind of add on to from earlier with a 2D barcode and being able to have that as a more accessible version for somebody to be able to see recall information, I think there's, before we kind of get to all of that, an importance of educating consumers on, like I was saying earlier, what a recall means and what you're actually looking for, which recall situations would be impactful to you and which might not be. Because, right, if somebody doesn't have a milk allergen, this class 1 recall for undeclared milk isn't impactful for them. It's not that it doesn't matter, because it obviously very much matters to those who have milk allergies, but it wouldn't matter to somebody like me or to my family who doesn't have that allergy. So there's an importance for trying to educate before we can then get to the increased visibility. And I know I've been speaking a lot. I have one quick example of this past few weeks. There was a recall for a product that was sold on Amazon, or actually, I'm sorry, let me clarify. The product wasn't sold on Amazon. The product that was being recalled wasn't sold on Amazon, but products similar to it were sold on Amazon. So Amazon did their due diligence and sent out a notice to consumers. And we got flooded with calls to the meat and poultry hotline of people trying to understand if their product was affected or not. And again, the product that was affected wasn't sold on Amazon. So if people had known what to look for and what pieces of information were important, they would have understood, oh, I don't have the product that's included in the recall, and they could have then been able to assess that for themselves. So.
Yeah, so I'm getting the wrap it up signal from Steve. So maybe we do have a little bit more time. So what I'm going to do is let maybe each of the panelists just give one quick parting word, and we'll start with Jen, and then we'll move to my right. Sorry to spring that on you. You're a Rutgers grad. I know you can handle it.
I think don't believe everything you read. Do your due diligence. Try to understand when people make grandiose statements about the world is ending and food safety, is terrible. Try to look at what data they're relying on when making those sorts of statements, because we can all pick the studies, we can all pick the data we want to support our point of view, and it is easy to kind of mix and match and portray things in different ways. So just go back to the data and make up your own mind.
Yeah, I'll just briefly interject because Jen stimulated me on this one. So if you guys remember last fall, there were a ton of media headlines about, is the food supply getting safe? Are we having more outbreaks? And when I did media on that, I had to say no. Like, I don't see any evidence of this. It just goes up and down. And yes, we had Boar's Head and we had a number of other highly publicized outbreaks. And yes, there's recalls, but no, there's not. We can't say definitively that things are getting worse. It's just that there's a lot in the news media right now.
I think I'll just kind of carry on with Jen's comment about letting data inform your decisions. And from a food company perspective, as well as you're evaluating whether a recall is necessary or whether or not your food is implicated in an outbreak, the importance of gathering facts and letting the data dictate that decision, and that's going to lead to better communications about the recall as well.
I talked a lot about my thoughts. But yes, to close and to follow out, myself especially in our team, I try and approach recall communications as a consumer, right? Because first and foremost, I am also a consumer just as much as I am a regulator and a communicator about regulatory things. But I approach things as a consumer and what would a consumer need to understand. And so if that's helpful and comforting for people out there, that there are people within FSIS like myself who, when we are putting out this information about very technical and complicated topics, we're doing our best to make sure that consumers will be able to understand that, and we're taking it seriously and understanding the importance of modernizing and trying to move in a forward direction of making these communications more clear and understandable for consumers, so that way it doesn't continue to be as confusing of a topic as it is. So
Thank you. And I know Wendolyn has some final words for all of us, but please, right now, join me in thanking all the panelists for the session.